to another episode of the Post Shift Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Shawn Soole. Today we have Noah Rothbaum. We're going to be talking about his brand new book, The Whiskey Bible. We were just in agreement when I was making a joke. It's like, just when you think that you don't need another whiskey book in your library, another one comes in, you're like, I really need this one. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. I'm really looking forward to digging into that. But we're also going to be talking about just like journalism in general, especially in the cocktail sphere, how that's changed over the last number of years, and how it's growing, and how do you keep being motivated in writing these books and continue to put out knowledge and finding knowledge? Is there anything new left? But good morning, Noah. Thank you for joining me.
Oh my God, thank you so much for having me on. I feel like a long time listener, first time caller. So it's a real honor and pleasure to be on the show.
I appreciate that very much. So usually we kick off the podcast with an origin story, and I'd love to know, how did you get into especially writing and editing the way that you sort of your bread and butter, but how did you get into that, rolling into like the cocktail spirits world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I sometimes ask myself, like, hey, it's like that David Byrne song, Talking Heads. Like, how did I get here? Like, um, I, I mean, it really starts for me with Dale DeGroff, right? So, like many folks in the industry, Dale has a sort of magical way of showing up when you need him, and we don't even realize that he's gonna. You don't even realize he's gonna change your life. And Dale is obviously the father of the rebirth of the cocktail. But in the back in the late '90s, I spent a semester in Scotland, which was amazing, and then I came home and I spent the summer working at Food and Wine magazine under a new associate editor named Pete Wells, who went on to win many Beard Awards and was the New York Times restaurant critic for many years. And Letty Teague was also there. She currently is the Wall Street Journal's wine columnist, and Kate Crater, who runs Bloomberg's Pursuits, was there. So, Pete had been the original Time Out New York, bar cocktail columnist. So it was like a personal, passion of his. And early on in that summer, I went to visit Dale with Pete over at Dale. He just left the Rainbow Room and was working at a bar called a restaurant called Blackbird. And he made us a couple of drinks. He heard I was from the Bronx. He was like, "Oh, you had the Bronx cocktail, right?" I was like floored, right? I didn't even know that there was a Bronx cocktail, right? I mean, I didn't know anything, right? You quickly realize you don't know anything. I was probably 21 at the time. Dale makes us a couple
Wow.
of drinks. I am floored. After spending the summer really learning about cocktails and spirits and researching stories about Irish whiskey and some other types of drinks, I was like in love, right? I had fallen completely for cocktails and spirits. The only problem was at the time, late '90s, early 2000s, like the job that I have today did not exist,
Hmm.
right? It's not, it was a very hard sell, as weird as this sounds, to get magazines, publications, anybody to publish writing about cocktails and spirits. And I remember, I was very jealous of Dave Wondrich because in the early 2000s, he had about a third of a page every month in Esquire, right? I
Yeah.
mean, like, we're talking like 200 words. I was like, man, that's so, I can't believe he gets to write 200 words every month about cocktails and spirits. Like, this is incredible, right? Like, and that was it, right? I mean, maybe Father's Day, Mother's Day, the holidays.
Hmm.
I'm convinced that Cinco de Mayo and the Kentucky Derby got as popular as they did in America and Canada because drinks writers were looking for an excuse to write about booze. So like any publication I could write for about drinks, I would, right? Um, but that was few and far between, and for a long time I thought, okay, like this is like a really, I find this topic incredibly fascinating. I mean, I like cocktails and spirits and drinking whiskey, but when I realized like how much history and untold stories and passion and characters and all of the like stuff behind what's in your glass was so fascinating to me. And I was like, other people's got to find this interesting, right? I hope
Hmm.
one day, and my first book came out in 2007, The Business of Spirits, which was very, very ahead of its time. Too far, I think, ahead of the curve. It was about trends in the different in the spirits industry, but like it was almost as the millennials might say, it was almost manifesting, right? Because you know it described a very nascent cocktail spirits culture that was building in the U.S., Canada, and the U.K. and in other parts of the world, but very, very small, right?
Hmm.
And in some ways, that book would probably do better if it was published today than in 2007. And then for a few years, I was writing about other, I was trying to write about spirits as much as I could and cocktails. But I'd write about, travel or food or consumer products. And then for about 4 years, I was the regional editor in chief of the site liquor.com, and I ran that. And then I left that to um, finish my book, The Art of American Whiskey, which is visual history told through label art and bottle design. I've been walking through Heaven Hills Bourbon Heritage Center, gone down to Kentucky to visit Maker's Mark, and Bill Samuels Jr. picked me up at Louisville Airport in his Astro van and broken air conditioning it all. And he said, "Oh, do you mind if we make a few stops?" I was like, "Bill, like whatever you want to say,
Yeah.
you
If Phil
tell me."
Samuel says, "Can we make some
Right,
stuff?" She's like, "Yeah,
right. I'm in your hands, omakase. Like whatever you want, I am. So he was like, "Oh, like my old French teacher works as a volunteer at the Bourbon Heritage Center." And I'm thinking, okay, Bill's like fairly, you know, older than I am. How old must this guy be, right? Of course, his high school teacher is like ancient. They're hugging and crying, and I'm like, I'm just give them a minute. So I walked around the Bourbon Heritage Center because I hadn't been there before, and I saw all these old labels and old bottles, and I thought, oh, that would be a really cool book, like a book about American whiskey, like label art. And then I walked another 5 feet, and I was like, I should do that book. And I went home, and I was like convinced, like I should do that. So I finished. That's how that book started. And then I was writing for the Wall Street Journal and a couple other places, and um, Dave Weinrich at the time was working on the Oxford Companion. He'd been working on it for a year or two. He was like, "Hey, like, would you help me on this project?" And of course, I said yes, like immediately. Like it was like total no-brainer. Did I realize it would take 8 years of my life? Absolutely not, right? But
yeah." It did take a really long
oh
time.
yeah, it took 10 years. I worked on it for 8 years. I mean, it's our own fault. I mean, it's the Oxford Companion to Spirits
Yeah.
and Cocktails. It's a real doorstop of a book. I mean, it's a defense. That you could use it for personal defense. You could use it for cracking walnuts. You could use it, prop up a car if your tire is flat. I mean, it's a huge book. Very incredibly proud of it. But it did take. It took me 8 years, and Dave was working on it for another 2 years, give or take. So doing that, and then I was also starting to write as a columnist for the Daily Beast, and ultimately, very quickly they brought me on to be their their drinking food editor, and I created the section Half Full, and Dave and I created the podcast Life Behind Bars, and I was at the Beast for about 6 years. We won 2 Tales of the Cocktail Plates for Best Spirits and Cocktail Publication, 2 plates for Life Behind Bars, a plate for the Oxford Companion. I won a plate at liquor.com. So I've been very lucky at the Tales of the Cocktail Awards, although I probably lost more of them than I've been won, which is
Yeah.
that's a different episode of this show, um, which is its own nightmare scenario. But yeah, and then now I'm over at Men's Journal as their spirits editor, and at Bartender Magazine as their editor at large. And the Whiskey Bible, was this crazy project that I really couldn't turn down. Workman has the Wine Bible, Karen McNeil's award-winning legendary book that came out about 25 years ago. Um, and they wanted to expand that out with first the Beer Bible, which came out a couple of years ago, and now the Whiskey Bible. So, it was one of these projects that they approached me in January of 2020, and I needed, I really, it's like almost immediate. I was like, okay, like I can do this. Like, let me, like, okay. It was too good to turn down. I was anything I was worried about following in Carrie McNeil's, giant footsteps because the Wine Bible is just, I mean, it's so wonderful and full
Hmm.
of so much information. So I knew that the Whiskey Bible had to live up to this very high standard that she had set with her book. Um, but yeah, I mean, I now sort of retroactively exhausted looking at it. I mean, the Whiskey Bible is more than 600 pages. For some reason, I thought it'd be a great idea to include an appendix with 60 cocktail recipes, 30
Yeah.
classics, 30 modern classics from some of the best bartenders on the planet. There's a whiskey timeline, which, I
Yep.
mean, people have done a timeline for individual types of whiskey, but never for all types of whiskey. And I think that was definitely a labor of love, but it's fascinating to see in the same year or same 5 year period that all of these different things happen around the world, and you get this very rare, like, macro view of the way that spirits and cocktails develop. And we often are so focused on one country, one region, one
Hmm.
brand that we don't see like how all of these things are interconnected, and methods and production styles and ingredients go around the world and reinvented, and how one thing has a direct effect on something else, around the other side of the earth. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's everything I thought I knew and more about whiskey.
So with everything, like from the time you started through the book productions, like
Yeah,
obviously, like the Whiskey Bible, it's a massive weapon of choice as well.
yeah,
But um, how have stories changed
yeah,
over the last, like, over your period in your career? How have the stories changed from, like, as you said, like Gainer Bronx from Dal Groff, which is just
right,
absolutely legendary. I had him on the show a few months ago, and one of the questions I finish with is like, what do you hope your legacy will be and how are you building it? I'm like, why am I asking Dale DeGroff this question at all?
yeah.
But how
It's
have stories changed as well as the platforms that those stories are uh,
yeah.
digested on? How have they changed over the
That's
years?
a wonderful question, and one that I don't think anybody's ever asked me. Um, so kudos to you. I would say that, like, up until fairly recently, right? Like, let's say 20, 25 years ago, most of what we knew was created by admin like Don Draper,
Hmm.
on Madison Avenue in boardrooms, right? Sitting around creating these incredible myths, legends, marketing campaigns, right, to sell alcohol, right? And why let the truth get in the way of a
Good story.
good story or good advertising copy line? And really, when I started out, I don't know, I naively thought, like, that if press release said, like, this brand had the oldest distilling license in Scotland, it had the oldest distilling license in Scotland. Obviously, that's like, a lot of these things, as it turned out, are not true at all, right? So, you know, I think, thanks to folks like Dave Wondrich and Wayne Curtis and Lou Bryson and Dave Broom, and Davin DeKirkamo, like, we, we, we no longer settle for the, like,
Hmm.
the PR truth, right? The truth that, like, if you Google it, what AI pulls up is often just like the old chestnut, right? It's the old, it's the thing that we've always said about this cocktail or this brand or this type of whiskey. And the crazy thing is, with the Whiskey Bible, I started to, really, go down these rabbit holes, right? Like, I was like, okay, like, I want to quote from this document. Like, I want, we all refer to X book or the Red Book of Ossory for Irish whiskey. But, like, what does it actually say? And it almost started like, okay, let me just include it as a quote. But the more of these things I started looking for and finding, I realized oh God, like none of these things say what we think they say.
Hmm.
And in fact, like, I thought the Whiskey Bible would basically be as my editor sold me on the project. Well, just write like everything you know. Like, just take what's in your brain, which would be hard enough, right? But
Yep.
okay, like doable. But then I realized, oh my God, like so much of what we all collectively know about whiskey isn't true. Like it was terrifying, right? I'd have these like epiphanies as I was like going through all these, you know, um, old newspapers, archives. I mean, a lot of the research was done during the COVID times, where a lot of libraries and archives had, digitized their holdings and allowed you to either search their archives, read things online, or even scan books and send you scans, which was like incredible. So it was just like suddenly like the dam broke, and it was like all of these new sources, new books, new magazines, new art nobody had read, and I'm reading all this stuff as they're coming in dribs and drabs, and like mind being blown on regular a regular rate at this point, and like having all these epiphanies and like being like, Dave, like I called Dave Waters to be like, Dave, like I don't think American whiskey was always aged in like new oak. Like, what do you mean? Like, well, I found this article from the 1930s, right after repeal, in a political column about how politicians were fighting. Basically, the Coopers had lost the beer market because they had switched to steel tanks, and they were worried that if American whiskey had switched to also like use barrels, they would go out of business.
Hmm.
So it was one of these things where also the bourbon guys. Oh, should we stop for
No, it's good.
the? Oh, a good
Just keep going. Roll.
New
This.
York, New York
Yes.
sounds of just another day in Manhattan, peaceful and tranquil as always. Uh, Nothing going on here.
We're in soundproof studios in our apartments.
Exactly. Um, but it was one of these crazy things where it turns out part of it was that bourbon tastes much better aged in a new barrel. Rye, according to the article, they weren't using new barrels, and part of this was that the bourbon producers, it was a way for them to kind of like take out their main competition by making the rye producers use new barrels, and just all of that. I was like,
Wow.
wait, what? And the story is right in that, like, looking at going the next few years, there's a lot of fighting in the halls of Congress over, like, all these rules that the Federal Alcohol Administration are creating, essentially statements of identity for the different categories so that they could collect taxes. But it has, that's the real truth, and it's not particularly romantic, but it's like that's the practical truth. And the more of these things I looked at, you realize how romantic or how romanticized so much of
Hmm.
alcohol and whiskey history has become. Where, like, we look at things like Macallan has the smallest stills in Scotland, Glenmorangie has the tallest stills in Scotland. Like, now, obviously, it's a hallmark of their signature flavor, but the time was everybody was buying used stills. I mean,
Hmm.
this was like what Anthony Bourdain always said. You're opening a restaurant, don't buy new equipment, buy used equipment. Your pots and pans will be dented and burned soon enough, so don't worry about it, right? That was the same thing. The distillers were all buying used equipment, and maybe that was the still that was available. Maybe the barn that they were building their distillery in was particularly short or particularly tall. Like, we don't really know. I mean, now it seems like they had made a concerted decision to, like, have the tallest stills or the shortest stills. But in reality, it's just a practical decision. So much of like whiskey history, it's the same thing. It's this
Mm.
idea that, like, looking back, like everything is romanticized, but like at the time, it was just a practical decision that was made because that's That's what we
Yeah,
use.
no. When they were opening Macallan, they were like, "We're going to have the shorter stills for that pure purpose of having the shorter stills as marketing." Because I think one thing that came out of the Oxford Companion was the whole story about Benedictine, and that
Right.
is like, and that's the exact same sort of thing as like, as you were saying, the story. You can't let the truth get in the way of a good story because like the marketing of it all, the existence of a lot of this stuff was based around like the PR man.
Right. Or we take a look at a category like Irish whiskey, where so much of it's made from malted and unmalted barley,
Mhm.
which again is a point of pride now, and it's separate and distinct from what folks do in Scotland. And it's one of these stories where at the time it had nothing to do with flavor, but it had to do with taxation, where the distillers were, the crown was like, we're gonna charge you depending on how much malted barley you use. And the distillers, because they're smart and crafty, were like, fine, we'll use malted and unmalted barley. We now just cut our tax bill in half. Like, okay. So, I mean, and that becomes like a flavor and a signature of Irish whiskey, which again had nothing to do with that. It had to do with lowering one's tax bill. But like that doesn't look good on a billboard, right? Or an ad. Like we use malted unmalted barley because like we didn't want to pay as much taxes. Like no, I mean like, but and even all of those little things. Part of it's also like there's been so much consolidation and brands, giant portfolios being built, and then like these companies, either selling off their spirits portfolios or getting into other industries, like we saw with Seagram's, where it's this incredible conglomerate, like with holdings all over the world, and then the Bronfmans essentially sell to Vivendi, and then they sell off this incredible portfolio of spirits brands, which then essentially has the effect of like creating other giants. I
Mhm.
know Ricard picks up tons of of all these brands, like Diageo, the same thing. Like, so it's like sort of like almost these like building and rebuilding these giant conglomerates over time, but it has the effect that people own brands and they have no idea about the brand's history, right? And nobody who works there knows about the real history. And most of these brands, what I found out long ago, like there are no archives, right? They're
Mhm.
just like with the Art of American Whiskey, I thought, oh, this is gonna be easy. Call up, people just send me, I'll talk to the archivist, they'll send me files, I'll select the photos, done, right? And like Brown Foreman does with Diageo, but even certain brands, it was like pulling teeth to get people, and some of it was just like you don't really have anything
Yeah.
from that era or for that brand. But
And we don't want to talk about it. And like I know Davin really well, and he's done some great work with
yeah,
Canadian whiskey. And like his last update to the book brought out a whole bunch of stuff that there was this romantic story about like the whiskey barons and stuff like that that have completely changed now.
right, right. I mean, it's just, I mean, even like my friend Todd Leopold out in Denver, a few years ago, he sort of became obsessed with the three chamber still, and to be honest, like most people had no idea what he was talking about, right? None of us had heard of this, or like we'd heard of it, but we didn't really understand like the significance. But when you
Mhm.
really look back in history, the log still, which literally was like a hollowed out log using steam technology, which turns into the chamber stills and the three chamber still, was revolutionary, right? It allowed American and Canadian distillers to make a whiskey that was separate and distinct than what was going on in Scotland and Ireland. But then, like, you piece together the full picture and you realize that, like, why did they need this, right? You're
Mhm.
like, I don't know. And then you realize that, like, in Scotland and Ireland, they're using copper pot stills, direct fire at the time, but they're draining off the solids, right? The spent grain. Where in America and Canada, we generally distill with the grain inside, like we're cooking the grain essentially in the still. And we're like, why, right? And it's well, the answer is that it makes better animal feed. And Canadian distillers and American distillers farming. Whiskey is obviously a farm product. We all know that, right? A lot of the original distillers, they would as a way to make their grain more shelf stable, increase its value, was making whiskey out of it. But part of it is also there's a circular economy where you're using the leftovers to feed cattle. The dung is fertilizer for the next round of growing grain. You can obviously eat the cattle, sell the cattle. But the funny thing is that you're cooking the grain because cattle cannot process, their
Hmm.
stomachs can't process really rich food. Because again, I'm a New York City boy. I don't know anything about feedlots or animals, feeding cattle. What am I talking? And you go down all these crazy rabbit holes, right? Because you need to understand what's going on. And in fact, it's more important to these distillers to make higher quality animal feed than it would be to make the whiskey. The
Hmm.
problem is, though, kind of like microwave popcorn, you know, our whiskey in Canada and America often had a burnt flavor to it because the solids would literally get burnt inside the copper pot still and it would taste burnt. And people would make fun of us in Europe and the UK for our whiskey because it tastes good, right? And we were like, okay, well, what do we do here? We wanna raise cattle. We need to raise cattle. We want to make whiskey. Well, this chamber still or the log still using steam allows you to cook the grain in the stills, which makes great feed, but you're not burning the whiskey anymore. So that's to put all of that together. I know I may have put some of your listeners to sleep, but to put all of that together, which I can now tell succinctly in about, I don't know what that was, 5 minutes, seemed like an eternity probably for some people, but 5 to 7 minutes, probably took years of research to put together, right? And that even that understanding why a lot of the whiskey, especially in Canada, why a lot of the whiskey makers have these giant feedlots.
Mm.
Why did they, because it's and why didn't we just use pot stills and pour off filter out the solids? Well, again, it's for the animal feed, and it's just one of these crazy things that then essentially changes the course of our history and whiskey history, allows people to raise cattle that are much bigger and more nutritious, right? So whiskey has this crazy way of changing the course of life, and the more I worked on this book, I thought I was going a little crazy because it just seemed like everything is connected to
You
whiskey.
pull thread, you pull a thread,
Right,
and the thread keeps coming and coming and coming and
right.
coming.
You're in just all this crazy stuff where you're just wait, what does this have to do with techniques for raising cattle or farming or all this stuff where you're just this we think about drinks as a sort of, as we should, kind of fun time, hobby, recreation, right? But it's one of the things that literally changes the world, right? It creates our modern society and culture. A lot of it is driven by either the production of whiskey or the production and consumption, right? Whether we're talking about, you know, epic, events like Prohibition in America, which obviously has a direct effect upon Canada, the
Hmm.
US, and Europe, but even in small ways like this, where we're pioneering new agricultural methods that then allow the folks in North America to be able to feed each other more effectively and easily. So it's one of those things where you're like, oh my god, am I ever going to finish this book?
Well, and that's a good question. Is like, was there a point as you were doing the book and researching, was there a point where you like, if I keep going, I'm just sort of like layering on different things? Because it does, like as you said, like
Yeah,
talk about whiskey in North America, talking about cow feed, then all of a sudden you're talking about cattle ranches, and how do you keep sort of like
right.
how do you contain the ecosystem?
Well, there was definitely. I think. Well, all right. Well, I guess starting with I have thoughts here, obviously. Um, start with a book of any book, but especially a book of this type of size. You need an outline, right? You need to break it down into digestible parts. if you're going to
Mhm.
tackle this, right? So for me, it was like, obviously, you know, the chapters had to sort of, I mean, every region area is different. There's like 5 chapters about the historic and, sort of legendary whiskey making areas, a chapter on, some of the areas that are fairly new to the industry, plus like, a background about whiskey and how to drink it and science and all this other stuff, right? And some of that stuff I have to admit, like, the chemistry part, I was the world's worst chemistry student in high school and college, right? Although if they taught it through the lens of whiskey, I probably would have found it a lot more interesting. But, and that's where, calling up folks and being like, do I have this right about enzymes? Like,
Mm,
do I have this right about like, sour mash and like even all of that stuff, which are terms that we throw around so much, but like from the practical distilling side, I've never worked
mhm,
as a for in a making mash or or making whiskey. I mean beyond like for a few minutes in a distillery on a tour, right? Um, so like learning all of that part, but then there to your original point, there were definitely moments where I was like, I would almost fall in love with each chapter, right? Where you get so engrossed in American whiskey or Scotch or Canadian whiskey or Irish whiskey, like all of these rabbit holes we sort of
mhm,
well, but then at a certain point be like, I gotta move on, right? This isn't just a book about X type of whiskey or X area or this person or and sometimes it was sort of sad to like leave these things, right? Especially once I figured them out to go to the next rabbit hole, right? And it's just this constant like almost breaking of one's heart where you're like, okay, I've done everything now. I mean, also satisfaction, like, oh my god, thank God, like this part of the book is over. But like, moving on and sort of like, you get comfortable and you're into that storyline, and then you got to keep moving because you can't. Sometimes there's nothing left to say, or you start adding stuff that like nobody is like interested in. And obviously I did have editors who went through all of these drafts. I mean, each of these chapters is like could be its own book essentially, right?
mhm.
So I mean, it's a Herculean task to like edit all of this, and some of the stuff that I thought was fascinating, they were like,
Yeah.
nobody cares about this, like you got to cut this crap out, like like I mean they were nicer about it than that, not much, but they were nicer than that. um but again, or you're doing something and it's like, oh wait, like which chapter does that fit into, right?
Mhm.
Because a lot of these stories are interwoven, and it's like, how do I, how do I tell this but not repeat it? I mean, obviously I can refer back to other sections, but a lot of like weird logistics like that. Thankfully, most of the brands we got in, the U.S. federal regulations finally came out for the new single malt category. It was like, basically right last December, just as the book was being readied for the printer. I was like, stop the presses. Like, I've got to change. We got to update this. And fortunately, it was like only really affecting 2 pages. And we got it in. And really, most of the like, I think it was like what Famous Grouse went from Edrington to William Grant's. We were able to get
Mhm.
that in, but I was like, please, everybody, stop buying and selling brands. Like, no more news. Like, until September, like when the book comes out. Like, you cannot do anything. Like, no big announcements, please. And fortunately and miraculously, I mean, a few things have changed, but like not. Sometimes it's like like Seagram's is breaking up, or
Yeah.
or X, or be like disastrous, right? But I mean, a few years would be great. Perfect for a second edition, but
Yeah.
knock on wood.
Yeah, Canada will have American whiskey back again.
Right.
Um, Canada, yeah, it's just in. I've got actually come as soon as I finish up with you. I've got to go into another interview about the impact of non impact of Canadian American products not being available in Canada right now, which is
Yeah.
just absolutely insane.
Yeah.
So, on a professional level, how has your way of doing things really changed? Because, as you said, like back in the day, David Wondrich had like that 200 word little third page
Yeah,
column in
yeah,
in Esquire. We went through the highlight of like cocktail culture, and you got a lot of print media and stuff, and then moved to digital and online spaces, which you've seemed to have adapted pretty good to that.
right.
Then, of course, you've got Bartender Magazine, which is the last like diehard
Yeah.
print magazine out there. I had Ryan on the show a couple of weeks ago. Um, how have you adapted to that? And then evolving into like social media, where like this next generation of bartenders and the social media influence has been, it's about that sort of almost going back to that 200 word
Right.
article in Esquire, where it's like
You're
digestible
right. You're right.
digestible bits. How have you adapted over that time? This is a tome. This is a
Yeah.
massive tome. How how are you adapting something like this into that sort of digestible bits that you can put out
I
digitally?
don't know how many millions of tweets we would need to tweet out the whole whiskey Bible. Especially it would need it would kill an AI chatbot. It would take a decade of nonstop posting day and night.
Just
I mean,
monkeys and typewriters.
exactly. Just yeah, like whatever, 60 characters at a time. It would take 30 years. Um, no, you're right. I mean, it's been kind of a roller coaster, and even at Men's Journal, like we now went back to print, so we do 4 issues a year. And the fall issue that I edited was all about whiskey, and that was like, to be honest, a dream come true, right? Like to literally say, I have a whole print issue to do. What stories do I want to tell? And it was great. We had Wayne Curtis wrote a story. We had an excerpt from Dave Weinstein's book. We had an excerpt from the Whiskey Bible. Camper English wrote a story. We had a story about travel, like somebody literally biking around Kentucky, with his friends. Like we had Chef Edward Lee, Anna Archibald interviewed him about the art of pairing whiskey with holiday meals. I was just like, it kind of felt like, okay, like this is like finally like a grown up like treatment of whiskey and cocktails, right? Where it's
Hmm.
not a joke, it's not a punchline. But you're right. I mean, it's been this kind of crazy roller coaster because at the beginning, nobody really 20, 25 years ago, it was hard to convince people to take this seriously. And then like we've been writing about it so long that I feel like a lot of publications and a lot of books are at such a high level that like the number of people who can truly appreciate them or understand them is very few. Like we've left so many people behind, right? Where, so much of the stuff that we take for granted, most normal people, even in our trade, do not understand. Like I'll do a talk a lot. I mean, I'll do talks, and a lot of times I'll get a question, and we'll say, somebody say like, "This is a stupid question." Surely believe A, that there are no stupid questions when it comes to cocktails and spirits. And B, if somebody's wondering about something, everybody else is trying to Google the same question
Hmm.
understandable on their phone, right? And somebody will say like, "What's the difference between bourbon and whiskey? What's the difference between scotch and whiskey?" Right? And I'll explain. Like now, I start every talk by saying whiskey is the general term
Hmm.
within each one of these categories. To be honest, that's where a lot of people are, and we, as an industry, we kind of forget that like a lot of that, the most basic info, let alone the nuances, have sort of been lost, right? And these are people who are buying fancy bottles of spirits, who are going to cocktail bars, going to fancy restaurants, and most people have no idea about cocktails and spirits, at least
Yeah.
in North America, right? I think it's maybe different in Europe, right? But here in Canada and the US, a lot of people drink out of fear, right? They don't know what to order, so they order what James Bond orders. They buy George Clooney's tequila because he's George Clooney. Like we
Yeah.
drink old fashions because that's what they were drinking on Mad Men. We're drinking Manhattans and Cosmos because that's what Carrie Bradshaw was drinking in Sex and the City. So it's one of these weird things where drinks writing, in some ways, we have gotten ever more sophisticated and complex, but often like we've left the reader
Mm.
behind, right? The whether they're in our trade or not, and they're just enthusiasts. Like we've left a lot of people behind because they don't understand what we're talking about at all. So I mean, part of the goal for the whiskey Bible and everything I do is like obviously to make it as approachable
Mm-hmm.
as we possibly can. Like so many of the rules about whiskey are not true. They're a joke. They were created in the last 30 years to sell booze. Like they're not this idea that you can't add anything to scotch. It's not like Coca-Cola and Pop Rocks and it's going to explode in your stomach. At the turn of the century, scotch becomes popular for two reasons. There's a newfangled game called golf, right, that becomes a sensation, and the drink of choice is the highball, right? Scotch, Tommy Dewar's running around America and Canada selling highballs, right? He's telling people to mix whiskey with club soda, right? They'd already been doing it with other types of drinks. That becomes super popular. So, I mean, basically, the bedrock of the Scotch industry is the highball. And we've spent the last 30 years telling people you can't even add like a tiny
Yeah.
bit. You're going to ruin it, right? So, I mean, I feel like part of like my duty as an author, journalist, expert, right, is to point out as much as I can that A, you should drink whiskey however you enjoy it,
Mm-hmm.
right? In whatever manner you enjoy it. You want Macallan and Mountain Dew? The only question is like, do you want that over like crushed ice, like a cube? Do you want a garnish? Like, look, I mean, you and I might not want that. I probably want to taste it, but like, is that going to be my signature drink? Probably not. But like for somebody else, if that's what they enjoy, then they should enjoy that, right? And it's also like whiskey is for everybody. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
why we it has the message has sort of gotten totally messed up, right? Everybody like whiskey belongs to nobody, right? I mean, this is something that all adults should feel like they can enjoy and enjoy the way that they want, right? It doesn't matter about anything, right? I mean, this is a universal thing that hopefully we can all agree upon is the wonders of drinking whiskey, right? So again, I just there's so much you know, pomposity and just, all this nonsense that's been layered on to whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, when you look into it, there's no historical basis, but it's like a sales tool. And then you realize, oh my God, like, we really, like, the way that we talk about whiskey, the way that we write about whiskey, like, we it's got to change, right? And that sort of like occurred to me early on writing the whiskey Bible. Like, this is like this is a completely different story than we all think, and the way that we present it should be different. So you're right. I mean, like, look, I think whether the format's print, whether the format's giant books, small books, social media, podcasts, videos, at the end of the day, it's about storytelling and making connections for people, right? Like, yes, the act of drinking is wonderful, but really it only enhances it when you know more about what's in your glass, right? The people who make it, the place where it's from. All of these things are reflected in how the whiskey tastes, and people's personal enjoyment only gets better, I think, when they have that connection to it and that
Mm-hmm.
knowledge, right? And that's at the end of the day, that's what we need. And it's we've often lost that, and we maybe as an industry haven't done a great job explaining like all of these things to drinkers, right, and bartenders, and certainly liquor store owners and salespeople.
Yeah, and sometimes the bigger brands, I would do a lot of work in the cognac space, so a lot of the bigger brands set the narrative for the whole
Yes,
category.
yes,
Like the big brands set the narrative for the whole entire category, even though they they know it may not be true. It is just that sales pitch is like,
right.
but it sets the tone. So going forward for the next couple of years, are you taking a break from writing books for the
Well,
next? What's your plan for the next
I
12 months?
like that would be sensible, right? But I have a new book coming out in the fall. It's not about whiskey, so thank God. You're like, oh my God, no mas. No, it is a book with the bartender Kenta Goto, who he
Oh,
had
nice.
he was the bar manager of Pegu Club for years. He was won bartender of the year at Tales of Cocktail several years ago. But he has two bars in New York, Bargoto Niban. Kenta grew up in Japan, but basically is professional bartender in New York now for I don't know how I guess now almost 20 years. So
Wow.
this book, I mean, he sort of rethought about everything that we do, almost like Dale DeGroff, right? I mean, obviously, Kento worked for Audrey Saunders, who was the founder of Baby Club. Audrey is Dale DeGroff's disciple, so it's the layers of influence here, right? Um, so it was really like a pleasure to work on that book with Kenta, like all his recipes and all his theories and methodology. So I can't wait for that book to come out in about a year. We're finishing that up. Be published by 10 Speed. So be a big, beautiful book. Eric Metzger, the incredibly talented photographer who's shot the cover of the Oxford Companion, photos from many, many Prince books, took all the photos. So I think that will probably blow people's minds in a completely different way, but like more from a bartending technique methodology way, because Kenta sort of thought about everything and rethought about it and perfected it, and you're like, wow, why don't we all do it like this, right? Like, and I think part of the reason why he did it was why he wanted to write this book was just, there's only so many bartenders Kenta can train, who work at his bars. So this was a way to obviously, um, for his teachings to reach like a bigger audience. And um, it was also a wonderful excuse for me and Kenta to hang out, which I really like. So I think we'll be very excited. I'll be very excited to hear your thoughts on that book and for people to dig in. And I think that has the potential to really, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but really change the way that, professional bartenders and amateur bartenders make cocktails. Way more effective, made more consistent and delicious. So fingers crossed that
Awesome.
yeah, that you like that.
So at the end of every podcast, I do 5 questions. They're deep podcast questions, I call them, for every single guest.
Whew.
So we'll kick it off. What is one lesson or experience that has shaped your perspective the most, and how do you carry that forward in your life, personal or career?
Oh man, one experience. That's a hard one. Well, I mean, obviously, I think, I mean, it's easier now looking back, right? Like, yeah. It's a harder question to answer when things are developing. But I think really, working on the Oxford Companion with Dave was, in many ways like a master class, right? I mean, I knew it would be good, right? That it would be interesting, but like, that kind of experience of working with so many of our contributors, we had over 100 contributors all around the world who are experts in their own field, and really delving into those topics with them and reading it was incredible, and kind of a defining career moment to be able to work on such an important project. So,
If you could leave one lasting message or piece of wisdom for the world, what would it be and why?
oh, that's easy. I mean, we already talked about it, that you should like literally drink whiskey any way you enjoy it, in the manner that you enjoy it. Like, do not let anybody bully you into like drinking something that you don't want to drink, or in a way that you don't want to drink it.
Looking back on your journey, what is something you wish you had understood earlier in life?
Whew. Well, I mean, I think some of these, I mean, the whole whiskey Bible is basically that, right? I mean, a lot of the things that I tried to answer in this book were questions I've had for 25 years, right? About, why did Irish whiskey disappear? Why was
Hmm.
it so popular? Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why I wrote this book and why Dave and I did the Oxford Companion was that, like, we needed these books, right? Like, we need them still, like, like all of that research and scholarship. So yeah, I mean, it's all of that knowledge in that giant book. I wish would have made my life a lot easier.
How do you define success, and has your definition of it changed over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think for everybody that's always a changing, uh, goals always change. And I think success now for me is like, I mean, I really, I I'm grateful for, everybody who reads my work or comes to talks, and, and if that gets them curious about the world and about our industry, then that's success, right? And that, that none of these things should be the end all and be all. Dave and I, with the Oxford Companion, we revealed all of our secret sources, our best sources that we tell anybody ever about, right? All the books, magazine articles, all the good stuff that we found over the years, right? They're all in the footnotes, right? Same thing with the Whiskey Bible. It's, a lot of people write stuff, especially in academia, where like they're trying to hide, like they're record collectors, right? They find three records, they buy all three, they break two, and they keep one. You know what I mean? Like they don't want anybody else to have this rare record. And for us, it's
Hmm.
like for all these books, it's like hopefully this just inspires people to go down their rabbit holes, their own rabbit holes, and to look at the sources and to come to their own conclusions that through their own research. I mean, that's an incredible experience. Like what the last few years, you know, Todd Leopold and I going down this crazy rabbit hole together about the three chamber still has been one of the best experiences of my professional life, and just so rewarding and so fun, and and really getting time to spend with Todd is one of my favorite things in the world.
What do you hope your legacy will be, and what steps are you taking to build it?
Oh God, um, well, I mean, I think trying to um, give folks like a platform, to write and to do their own research and to tell these stories, all these writers, I think it's important. We kind of often take for granted that writers have platforms, and, I think it's important to support all these people, in their endeavors, and that moves the industry forward, right? I mean, in ways that we didn't even understand. I mean, Dave published his book Punch. I was like, why does he write about punch? Like, what a weird topic. What I mean? What did we know? I mean, this was a year. I mean, this was like 20 years ago. It's like punch. Like, I mean, punch was something that college students would make in garbage cans, right? Like, what did we know, right? And now everybody around the world drinks punch, right? Everybody drinks old fashions. Everybody like all this stuff that was all this like weird niche stuff that I thought maybe it would be awesome to get just a few people into. Now, like you can walk in most bars and get a Negroni. You get an old fashioned. It doesn't
Yep.
matter. I mean, maybe it's not the best one, but they no longer like
Crap.
completely right. We're completely confused. Like,
Yep.
what's an old fashioned again? Like, how do I make that? Like, what's in that? Like, that's like thankfully those days are behind us. So again, I mean, I think just trying to push this industry forward. Enrich it for everybody. I think it's really special to create opportunities not just for yourself but other people, right? And that's wonderful. I mean, what you do with your show, I mean, is really wonderful because it highlights and features a vast range of different people in our industry doing incredible things, and you interviewing them and bringing attention to them is such a wonderful thing. So thank you for doing that.
I appreciate it. Thank you. So just one last plug. The Whiskey Bible. Just when you thought you had all the whiskey books in the world, another one came out and you need it. This is really fantastic. Like I just listening to you, I'm looking forward to digging into it way more. I keep doing the wrong things as mirrored. But yeah, like the Whiskey Bible is a fantastic. Like what people write Bibles all the time, but like this is a tome.
Well,
This is
thank you.
amazing. But
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you so much for your time, man. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've followed you and listened to you and read you for many years, and
Oh,
it's nice now that I'm getting to the stage with the podcast that I get people reaching out to me, or I reach out to people and they say yes straight away. Like
yeah.
5 years ago, it's like I don't know who you are. Go away. Now I get a little bit of leverage, and I start having. And I've got like a vision board. I always mention my
And
vision board where I've got all the people I want to have on the show,
yeah.
and then I just schedule and roll out from there. So, but I just
Well,
want to say thank you so much for your time.
well, well, thank you for having me on it. Keep up the good work. Looking forward to listening to more shows that you do, more episodes.
Thank you, sir. Well, and good luck with the book, and good luck with next year and another book, and
Oh, thank
everything
you.
else that you're doing. But thank you so much.